14th of November, year of the depend adult undergarment. Poor Tony Krause had a seizure on the T. It happened on a Grey Line train from Watertown to Inman Square, Cambridge. He'd been drinking codeine cough syrup in the men's room of the Armenian Foundation Library in horrid central Watertown, Massachusetts for over a week. Darting out from cover, only to beg a scrip from hideous Equus Reese and then dash in the Brooks Pharmacy wearing a simply vile ensemble of synthetic fiber slacks and suspenders and tweed dongal cap he'd had to cage from a longshoreman's union hall. Poor Tony couldn't dare wear anything comely, not even the Antitoy Brothers red leather coat, not since that poor woman's bag had turned out to have a heart inside. He had simply never felt so beset and overcome on all sides as the black July day when it fell to his lot to boost a heart. Who wouldn't wonder, why me? He didn't dare dress expressive or ever go back to the square, and Emil still had him marked for demapping as a consequence of that horrid thing with Woe and Bobby C. last winter. Poor Tony hadn't dared show one feather east of Tremont Street, or at least the Brighton Projects, or even Delphina's in backwater Enfield since last Xmas. Even after Emil simply dematerialized from the street scene, and now since 29th of July, he was non grata at Harvard Square and environs, and even the sight of an Oriental now gave him palpitations, say nothing of an Angner accessory. Thus, poor Tony had no way to cop for himself. He could trust no one enough to inject their wares. St. Cheese and Lola Sister were no more trustworthy than he himself. He didn't even want them to know where he slept. He began drinking cough syrup. He managed to get Bridget Tenderhole and the strictly rough trade Stokely Dark Star to cop for him on the Wink for a few weeks, until Stokely died in a Fenway hospice, and then Bridget Tenderhole was shipped by her pimp to Brockton under maddeningly vague circumstances. Then poor Tony had read the dark portents and swallowed the first of his pride and hid himself even more deeply in a dumpster complex behind the IBPWDW local number 4 hall in Fort Point downtown, and resolved to stay hidden there for as long as he could swallow the pride to send Lola's sister out to acquire heroin, accepting without pride or complaint the shameless rip-offs the miserable bitch perpetrated upon him, until a period in October when Lola's sister went down with hepatitis G and the supply of heroin dried horribly up, and the only people even copying enough to chip were people in the position to dash here and there to great beastly lengths under an open public access sky, and no friend, no matter how dear or indebted, could afford to cop for another. Then, wholly friend and connectionless, poor Tony in hiding began to withdraw from heroin. Not just get strung out or sick, withdraw. The words echoed in his neuralgic and wigless head with the simply most awful, sinister footsteps echoing deserted corridor quality. Withdraw, the wingless fowl, turkeyfication, kicking, the old cold bird. Poor Tony had never once had to withdraw, not all the way down the deserted corridor of withdraw, not since he first got strung out at 17. At the very worst, someone kind of had always found him charming if things got dire enough to have to rent out his charms. Alas, thus about the fact that his charms were now at low ebb. He weighed 50 kilos, and his skin was the color of summer squash. He had terrible shivering attacks and also perspired. He had a sty that had scraped one eyeball as pink as a bunny's. His nose ran like twin spigots, and the output had a yellow-green tinge he didn't think looked promising at all. There was an uncomely dry rot smell about him that even he could smell. In Watertown, he tried to pawn his fine auburn wig with removable chignon, and was cursed in Armenian because the wig had infestations from his own hair below. Let's not even mention the Armenian pawnbroker's critique of his red leather coat. Poor Tony got more and more ill as he further withdrew. His symptoms themselves developed symptoms, troughs and nodes he charted with morbid attention in the dumpster, in his suspenders and horrid tweed cap, clutching a shopping bag with his wig and coat and comely habiliments he could neither wear nor pawn. The empty Empire Displacement Company dumpster he was hiding in was new and apple green, and the inside was bare, dimpled iron, and it remained new and unutilized because persons declined to come near enough to utilize it. It took some time for poor Tony to realize why this was so. For a brief interval, it had seemed like a break, fortune's one wan smile. An EWD land barge crew set him straight in language that left quite a bit of tact to be wished for, he felt. The dumpster's green iron cover also leaked when it rained, and it contained already a colony of ants along one wall, which insects poor Tony had ever since a neurasthenic childhood feared and detested, in particular, ants. And in direct sunlight, the quarters became a hellish living environment from which even the ants seemed to vanish. With each step further into the black corridor of actual withdrawal, poor Tony Krause stamped his foot and simply refused to believe things could feel any worse. Then he stopped being able to anticipate when he needed to, as it were, visit the powder room. A fastidious gender dysphoric horror of incontinence cannot properly be described. Fluids of varying consistency began to pour without advance notice from several openings. Then, of course, they stayed there, the fluids, on the summer dumpster's iron floor. There they were, not going anywhere. He had no way to clean up and no way to cop. His entire set of interpersonal associations consisted of persons who did not care about him, plus persons who wished him harm. His own late obstetrician father had rended his own clothing in symbolic Shiva in the year of the Whopper in the kitchen of the Krause home, 412 Mount Auburn Street, horrid central Watertown. It was the incontinence plus the prospect of 11-4's monthly social assistant checks that drove poor Tony out for a mad scampering relocation to an obscure Armenian Foundation library men's room in Watertown Center, wherein he tried to arrange a stall as comfortably as he could with shiny magazine photos and cherished knickknacks and toilet paper laid down around the seat and flushed repeatedly, and tried to keep true withdraw at some sort of bay with bottles of Codenex Plus. A tiny percentage of codeine gets metabolized into good old C17 morphine, affording an agonizing hint of what real relief from the bird might feel like, i.e., the cough syrup did little more than draw the process out, extend the corridor. It slowed up time. Poor Tony Krause sat on the insulated toilet in the domesticated stall all day and night, alternately swilling and gushing. He held his high heels up at 1900 hours when the library staff checked the stalls and turned off all the lights and left poor Tony in a darkness within darkness so utter he had no idea where his own limbs were or went. He left that stall maybe once every 2 days, scampering madly to Brooks in cast-off shades and a kind of hood or shawl made pathetically of brown men's room paper towels. Time began to take on new aspects for him now as withdrawal progressed. Time began to pass with sharp edges. Its passage in the dark or dim-lit stall was like time being carried by a procession of ants, a gleaming red martial column of those militaristic red southern U.S. ants that build hideous tall boiling hills. And each vile gleaming ant wanted a minuscule little portion of poor Tony's flesh in compensation as it helped bear time slowly forward down the corridor of true withdrawal. By the second week in the stall, time itself seemed the corridor, lightless at either end. After more time, time then ceased to move or be moved throughable and assumed a shape above and apart, a huge, musty-feathered, orange-eyed, wingless fowl hunched incontinent atop the stall with a kind of watchful but deeply uncaring personality that didn't seem keen on poor Tony Krause as a person at all or to wish him well. Not one little bit. It spoke to him from atop the stall, the same things over and over. They were unrepeatable. Nothing even poor Tony's grim life experience prepared him for the experience of time with a shape and an odor squatting. And the worsening physical symptoms were a spree at Bonwitz compared to time's black assurances that the symptoms were merely hints, signposts pointing up at a larger, far more dire set of withdrawal phenomena that hung just overhead by a string that unraveled steadily with the passage of time. It would not keep still and would not end. It changed shape and smell. It moved in and out of him like the very most feared prison shower assailant. Poor Tony had once had the hubris to fancy he'd had occasion really to shiver ever before. But he had never truly, really shivered until time's cadences, jagged and cold and smelling oddly of deodorant, entered his body via several openings, cold the way only damp cold is cold. The phrase he'd had the gall to have imagined he understood was the phrase chilled to the bone. Shard-studded columns of chill entering to fill his bones with ground glass, and he could hear his bones joints glassy crunch with every slightest shift of hunched position, time ambient and in the air and entering and exiting at will, coldly, and the pain of his breath against his teeth. Time came to him in the falcon black of the library night in an orange mohawk and merry widow with tacky Amalfi pumps and nothing else. Time spread him and entered him roughly and had its way and left him again in the form of endless gushing liquid shit that he could not flush enough to keep up with. He spent the longest morbid time trying to fathom whence all the shit came from when he was ingesting nothing at all but Codenex Plus. Then at some point he realized time had become the shit itself. Poor Tony had become an hourglass. Time moved through him now. He ceased to exist apart from its jagged-edged flow. He now weighed more like 45 kilograms. His legs were the size his comely arms had been before withdrawal. He was haunted by the word Zuckung, a foreign and possibly Yiddish word he did not recall ever before hearing. The word kept echoing in quick-step cadence through his head without meaning anything. He'd naively assumed that going mad meant you were not aware of going mad. He'd naively pictured madmen as forever laughing. He'd kept seeing his sonless father again, removing the training wheels, looking at his paper, wearing a green gown and mask, pouring iced tea in a pebbled glass, tearing his sports shirt in filial woe, grabbing his shoulder, sinking to his knees, stiffening in a bronze casket, being lowered under the snow at Mount Auburn Cemetery through dark glasses from a distance, chilled to the zuckung. When, then, even the funds for the codeine syrup were exhausted, he still sat on the toilet of the rear stall of the AFL loo, surrounded by previously comforting hung habiliments and fashion magazine photographs he'd fashioned to the wall with tape caged on the way in from the reference desk. Sat for almost a whole nother night and day because he had no faith that he could stem the flow of diarrhea long enough to make it anywhere, if anywhere to go, presented itself in his only pair of gender-appropriate slacks. During hours of lit operation, the men's room was full of old men who wore identical brown loafers and spoke Slavic and whose rapid-fire flatulence smelled of cabbage. Toward the end of the day of the second syrupless afternoon, the day of the seizure, poor Tony Krause began to withdraw from the cough syrups, alcohol and codeine and demethylated morphine, now, as well as from the original heroin, yielding a set of sensations for which not even his recent experience had prepared him, the alcohol withdrawal especially. And when the true DT type, big-budget visuals commenced, when the first glossy and minutely hirsute army ant crawled up his arm and refused ghost-like to be brushed away or hammered dead, poor Tony threw his hygienic pride into time's porcelain maw and pulled up his slacks. Mortifyingly wrinkled from 10-plus days puddled around his ankles, made what slight cosmetic repairs he could, donned his tacky hat with scotch-tape scarf of paper towels, and lit out in last-ditch desperation for Cambridge's Inman Square for the sinister and duplicitous Antitoy brothers, their glass entertainment and notions-fronted operations center he'd long ago vowed never again to darken the door of and but now figured to be his place of very last resort. The Antitois Canadians of the Quebec subgenus, sinister and duplicitous, but when it came down to it, rather hapless political insurgents he'd twice availed of services through the offices of Lola's sister, now the only persons anywhere he could claim somehow owed him a kindness since the affair of the heart. In his coat and scally cap-over scarf on Watertown Center's underground Gray Line platform, when the first hot, loose load fell out into the baggy slacks and down his leg and around his high heel, he still had only his red high heels with the crossing straps, which the slacks were long enough to mostly hide. Poor Tony closed his eyes against the ants formicating up and down his arms' skinny length, and screamed a soundless interior scream of utter and soul-scalded woe. His beloved boa fit almost entirely in one breast pocket, where it stayed in the name of discretion. On the crowded train itself, then, he discovered that he'd gone in 3 weeks from being a colorful and comely, albeit freakishly comely, person to being one of those loathsome urban specimens that respectable persons on T trains slide and drift quickly away from without even seeming to notice they're even there. His scarf of paper towels had come partly untaped. He smelled of bilirubin and yellow sweat, and wore week-old eyeliner that simply did not fly if one needed a shave. There had been some negative urine incidents as well in the slacks to round matters out. He had simply never in his life felt so unattractive or been so sick. He wept silently in shame and pain at the passage of each brightly lit public second's edge, and the driver ants that boiled in his lap opened needle-teethed little insectile mouths to catch the tears. He could feel his erratic pulse in his thigh. The Gray Line was a green and orange line, trundling behemoth-type train, and he sat all alone at one end of the car, feeling each slow second take its cut. When it descended, the seizure felt less like a separate, distinct health crisis than simply the next exhibit in the corridor of horrors that was the old, cold bird. In actual fact, the seizure, a kind of synaptic firefight in poor Tony's desiccated temporal lobes, was caused entirely by withdrawal not from heroin, but from plain old grain alcohol, which was Codenex Plus, cough syrup's primary ingredient and balm. He'd consume upwards of 16 little 80-proof bottles of Codenex per day for 8 days, and so was cruising for a real neurochemical bruising when he just up and stopped. The first thing that didn't augur very well was a shower of spark-sized phosphenes from the ceiling of the swaying train. This, plus the fiery violet aura around the heads of the respectables who quietly retreated as far as possible from the various puddles in which he sat. Their clean pink faces looked somehow stricken, each inside a hood of a violet flame. Poor Tony didn't know that his silent whimpers had ceased to be silent, was why everyone in the car had gotten so terribly interested in the floor tiles between their feet. He knew only that the sudden and incongruous smell of Old Spice stick deodorant, classical original scent, unbidden and unexplainable, his late obstetric papa's brand, not smelled for years, and the tiny panicked twitters with which withdraw's ants skittered glossily up into his mouth and nose and disappeared, each of course taking its tiny pincered farewell bite as it went, augured some new and vivider exhibit on the corridor's horizon. He'd become, at puberty, violently allergic to the smell of Old Spice. As he soiled himself and the plastic seat and floor once again, the classic scent of times past intensified. Then poor Tony's body began to swell. He watched his limbs become airy white dirigibles and felt them deny his authority and detach from him and float sluggishly up, snout first, into the steel mill sparks the ceiling rained. He suddenly felt nothing, or rather, nothing. A pre-tornadic stillness of zero sensation, as if he were the very space he occupied. Then he had a seizure. The floor of the subway car became the ceiling of the subway car, and he was on his arched back in a waterfall of light, gagging on Old Spice and watching his tumid limbs tear ass around the car's interior like some undone balloons. The booming zuckung, zuckung, zuckung was his high heels drumming on the soiled floor's tile. He heard a rushing train roar that was no train on earth and felt a vascular roaring, rushing that until the pain hit seemed like the gathering of a kind of orgasm of the head. His head inflated hugely and creaked as it stretched, inflating. Then the pain, Caesar's hurt, is what few civilians have occasion to know, was the sharp end of a hammer. There was a squeak and rush of release inside his skull, and something shot from him into the air. He saw Bobby seize, blood misting upward in the hot wind of the Copley blower. His father knelt beside him on the ceiling in a well-rended sleeveless tee, extolling the Red Sox of Rice and Lynn. Tony wore summer taffeta. His body flopped around without OK from HQ. He didn't feel one bit like a puppet. He thought of gaffed fish. The gown had 1,000 flounces and a saucy bodice of lace crochet. Then he saw his father, green-gowned and rubber-gloved, leaning to read the headlines off the skin of a fish a newspaper had wrapped. That had never happened. The largest print headline said, "Push." Poor Tony flopped and gasped and pushed down inside, and the utter red of the blood that feeds sight bloomed behind his fluttering lids. Time wasn't passing so much as kneeling beside him in a torn t-shirt disclosing the rodent-nosed tits of a man who disdains the care of his once comely bod. Poor Tony convulsed and drummed and gasped and fluttered, a fountain of light all around him. He felt a piece of nourishing and possibly even intoxicating meat in the back of his throat, but elected not to swallow it, but swallowed it anyway, and was immediately sorry he did. And when his father's bloody rubbered fingers folded his teeth back to retrieve the tongue he'd swallowed, he refused absolutely to bite down ungratefully on the hand that was taking his food. Then, without authorization, he pushed and bit down and took the gloved fingers clean off, so there was rubber-wrapped meat in his mouth again, and his father's head exploded into needled antennae of color like an exploding star between his gown's raised green arms and a call for zakung, while Tony's heels drummed and struggled against the widening stirrups of light they were hoisted into, while a curtain of red was drawn wetly up over the floor he stared down at Tony, and he heard someone yelling for someone to give in, with a hand on his lace belly as he bore down to push, and he saw the legs in the stirrups they held would keep spreading until they cracked him open all the way inside out on the ceiling, and his last worry was that red-handed Papa could see up his dress what was hidden.